To today's Career Month program. My name is Adam Sylvain, and I work with the Alumni Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Writing Resumes Recruiters Want to Read. Today we will hear from two-time Maroon alumna Liz Handlin. Liz earned both a BA from the University of Chicago and an MBA from the Booth School of Business. She is now CEO of Ultimate Resumes and has more than 20 years of experience in marketing, recruiting, communications, and resume writing. Since launching Ultimate Resumes, she has helped hundreds of clients create resumes that have opened doors to many exciting new job opportunities. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to cede the floor to Liz.
Hello, am I here? Okay.
You are here.
Hi, I'm Liz. Hi, I'm Liz Handlin. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas, where the weather is probably much nicer than it is if you happen to be in Chicago. Today, what I'm going to talk about, you won't see me on screen the whole time. We're going to talk about the overarching strategy when you're writing a resume. There's a million books you can read about writing resumes. A lot of them, I think, give pretty poor advice. You can ask your neighbor, you can ask some recruiters. Everybody's got an opinion, but I've actually done a lot of work working with recruiters, working with executives to figure out what do they really want to see and how do they want to see it presented. Keep in mind that a resume is just one piece of your overall job search strategy. Since we don't have time in this presentation to talk about strategy, I'll recommend two books. I know the author of one that do a great job of walking you through job search strategy. One of them is kind of a workbook, and it's really excellent. There may also be some videos available from previous webinars done through University of Chicago for this series that talk job search strategies. So recruiters and hiring managers like for a resume to be easy to navigate and for it to tell them what problems does this person solve. Because behind every job opening, there's a different story. Job postings are usually kind of generic. They don't tell you a lot, but the reason that job was posted is the real are the things that you need to think about for your resume. So any information as you look for jobs, I never recommend spending most of your time looking online. Any information you can find out about what's really going on in the company will help you, because what they may be looking for a CPA with 20 years of experience, but what they're really looking for is a CPA with 20 years of experience in the type of organization that's going through the type of challenges that they're going through. So what problems are you great at solving, and in what situations? That's what you want your resume to communicate that. Now, I'm going to recommend you use the format that I use, and I'll explain why. However, format isn't what drives the resume process, it's the content. And there are a few firm no's for resumes that are used in the United States. The exception to these resume don'ts are if you are in advertising or creative field that requires visual resumes. Don't put your picture on your resume, just don't. Do not put on your personal philosophy. Do not put on quotes from Yoda. I've seen this, and it was hilarious, but it didn't help the person get a job. It just made all of us laugh. Do not put on charts or graphs. Do not do your resume in PowerPoint form. Don't use colored fonts. Black and white is just fine. And if you feel you need to share websites or YouTube videos to explain what you do, and many people do, especially when it comes to product demonstrations, that's what LinkedIn is for. That is a perfect place for all that additional information that isn't really appropriate on your resume. Okay, so with all of the don'ts said, I'm going to try to get you navigated to the screen. So I'm going to go off camera and pull up this resume. Okay. Is the screen? Can you all? How do I find out?
Yep, the resume is pulled up. Yep, all good.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm going to just start at the top. When I write a resume for a client, I actually start at the beginning of their career and move to the present day. And I do that because there's a couple of things that are really important with a resume that people don't think of. The transitions you make, why did you move from one job to the next? Not why did you leave a job. That's not usually a very interesting story, and it usually boils down to a few reasons. But there's usually, particularly after you have a few years of experience, there's usually a reason that you've been recruited to, selected for, or hired to, or promoted to whatever position you're in now. And the further along your career you go, the more that reason solidifies. You have a reputation for doing something great, or a series of things great, in doing so in one or more different types of environments. So it could be within a manufacturing environment, a publicly traded company, a venture-backed firm, startups. Think about the environment in which you exist and what's going on in the company at the time. That's also very important. I've done resumes for people who navigated in the financial world through the 2008 financial crisis. That's a really important piece of the story for a lot of these people. And that's just one example. There are many, many transitions that industries go through. And if you're in an industry in transition and your job in any way is affected by that transition, then you want to mention that on the resume, that you successfully led your team through a bankruptcy or whatever it is, because that can be very, very important to hiring managers. All right. So I could go on all day, but I don't have all day and you don't either. So we'll start at the top. Make the top of your resume just simple so that you don't have to include addresses. This is always a question I get. You don't have to include addresses. I'm old school, so if on my personal resume, which I don't even hand out, I do have my address, but I understand there are a lot of reasons people might not want to. So address is optional. Phone number is not. Make sure you spell your name right. Make sure you got your email right. And I say that because I've seen mistakes made. So just proofread carefully. This executive profile section is probably one of the most misused sections of the resume. People put things like their core competencies. They put lists of things they know how to do, but they're taken out of context. So just saying that, I know project management or I'm a strong leader, taken out of context, those are just words and your opinions about yourself. So what you want to do in an executive profile, and this ties back to what I told you our overarching goal is to show people what kind of problems can I solve. And you think of your executive profile as your elevator pitch. You can have 2, 3, 4 bullet points, but those bullet points need to tell the reader, if I'm reading about a CFO, a COO, whatever your title is, what kind am I reading about? Because any job title, and sometimes job titles can be really wacky these days, but any job title or job that you have can vary wildly depending on the environment in which you're operating. So if you're the CEO of a rapidly growing tech firm, that's a completely different experience than being the CEO of a startup that's trying to get venture capital funding. So, and everything that's in that executive profile needs to be backed up by facts in the resume. Think of it as a proof. And so anyway, so in this particular one, I'm describing this person as an executive leader and trusted advisor to CEOs with a track record of determining optimal business strategy and execution plans to leverage both new and legacy. Well, you can read it. I'm stumbling over my words a little bit. But whatever you put in the executive profile, you're thinking about the reader. What do you want someone to know about you, and what are the special skills that you have in certain environments? Because that can really help somebody to rapidly say, oh, you're right for this job or you're not. And it helps. And if you're not right for a job, you'd want to know quickly, right? So, for example, if somebody's looking for, let's say, a leader who has worked for venture-backed companies, and that's the thing. I mean, I know recruiters at for venture firms who won't hire any leaders of their portfolio companies if they haven't, in his words, seen the movie before, if they haven't worked for other venture-backed firms. So that's the kind of thing that you want to make sure you have in the profile, because that's what folks are looking for. Okay, so let's get into the body of the resume. And I've shown, if you really go through this, you'll realize that it is pretty much, that this might not be an obvious career trajectory, but what I was trying to do is show you how you might present different kinds of companies. So the first one is Mckinsey Company. A lot of people from the University of Chicago wind up at Mckinsey, great firm. I'll let you, you can read through this, but what we're trying to show is this. As an engagement manager, we also want to show and actually normally, here's what I would do. I would put this, I would actually put that right there, because you want people to see what area you're in. You want to narrow down what you do as much as possible so people can get a handle on what your area of specialty is. And then when it comes to consulting engagements, and the same is true a lot of times for attorneys. I work with attorneys sometimes, and while you certainly can't list your clients, what you can do is list them in a way where somebody can say, oh, a $4 billion technology services firm. I led a team to do, what did you do? How large was your team? Sometimes you might want to say how long the engagement is, because sometimes engagements can go on at these large firms for years. And it's completely reasonable that if you work for McKinsey for 2 or 3 years, you were on one engagement the entire time. So then what you can do is indicate that and talk about the different projects that you led or participated in throughout your tenure. If you're a partner at McKinsey and you're responsible for generating business, you might talk about how much business you generate in a year, how many millions. And if you can, you can, if you're allowed to do so, if your firm doesn't prohibit it, you should also say, you know, that you generate 20 million in annual revenue in an office that generates, you know, 100 million. So that somebody gets a sense for the size and scope of what you're what you're delivering. And that can be especially helpful in smaller firms. I worked with a client once who was in a relatively small consulting firm, but she was delivering 80% of the annual revenue personally. So that's a big deal. And that context, matters. All right. Now, what I did not do in this resume, because again, my purpose here is just to show you how you might present different jobs, was to really talk about transitions. But under normal circumstances, what you would see, since McKinsey's the first job on the resume and therefore the most recent, we would say something like recruited to McKinsey because of whatever background, to lead the newly formed Chicago office technology and telecommunications sector, or to turn around an underperforming group, or to increase rapid growth, something like that. The why did you join? And I would expect that you'd probably see similar types of things backwards in the resume, because again, you develop this reputation as you go through your career. So a lot of people ask me, hey, everybody's heard of McKinsey. Why do I have to say that it's a $7 billion global management consulting firm with 17,000 employees? Well, my answer is you don't have to. And I have some clients who, after I create a resume like this, will go through and take out all of the descriptors just to save room, or because they feel like it's not necessary. But here's why I do it. Number one, even if everybody's heard of McKinsey, they may not know that it's a $7 billion, how big it is. They may not know how many employees, and maybe you want them to know that. The other thing is, not everybody's heard of every company. I bet there's some of you here on this call who haven't heard of Philips Services in Houston. Just because if you're not in that industry, why would you have? So it can be really helpful to show the size and scope. And it can also be helpful if the company has rapidly grown or shrunk while you were there. So to the extent that you can, you'd like to have the numbers, what the company was doing when you were there. And then you can say it has since been acquired or gone out of business, or has transitioned to offer some other service. And you don't have to get into a lot of detail. I would say no more than 3 lines, and 3 lines is pushing it. But this can be really, really helpful to recruiters, and especially if your resume is seen by an in-house human resources person who may or may not have the breadth of experience to know a lot of different industries. And I do know people whose skills are such that they span a lot of different industries, and in some cases go from Fortune 100 company to a startup and back. And again, it's just, you want to spoon feed people your background and not make them do the work to have to go Google Philips Services and figure out what it is. So in this particular case, so this is another job. This guy was president of one part of Philips Services, the environmental services group. So he was president. Being president covers a lot of ground, right? But what we tried to do here, it turns out that the real keys to what he was doing fell into 2 categories: overall company growth and technology. This particular person, that's something that follows him his entire career. Everything is about the technology, utilizing cutting edge technology to increase growth. So if you saw this actual resume with a lot more, background, you would see that this was repeated over and over. So to make it easy for the reader, instead of having just a line of bullet points, we broke it up into these two categories so that somebody can rapidly see, oh, I get it. He's a rapid growth guy. He uses technology, and this is the consistent message through his career. So if you have a job that is chief marketing officer, president, chief operating officer, if your job covers a lot of ground, maybe think about breaking the actual job itself up into these buckets. In this case, you can see what they are, but it could be any number of things. And you don't want to have too many, but usually if you really push yourself, you can figure, okay, well, really I'm responsible for 3 or 4 buckets of responsibility, even though there's a lot of stuff that falls within those. You want to really organize it and simplify it and streamline it as much as you can for the reader, because everything we're doing is for the reader. Okay, so in this case, the guy started as, he was recruited to the company to lead a restructuring, and you can see what he did. And he did that for a few years, and then at that point he was promoted. We said appointed, and the reason was because he was appointed by the board, but it doesn't say that here. So he was recruited to lead a restructuring. You always want to say if you're recruited, because if you're recruited, it means you're probably pretty good at what you did. All right. So here, if you were, let's say you had a completely different job. Let's say you're a trainer, a program manager, systems trainer. A lot of times people who are in jobs like training or, sometimes they don't feel like they can show the same kind of results. It's easier to show results if you're in sales, or if you have a job where you're the CEO of a company. There's a lot of metrics there. But if you have a job that's not necessarily driven by metrics that you can control, because you can train people and you can train them well, but what if they don't do the work, that's not really on you. So what we tried.
Hi, Liz, we just lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Where did I cut out?
Just like 5 seconds ago. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So in the case of, I guess what I'm getting at is not every job necessarily has metrics attached to it. It's always great if you do. But if you don't, just think about, what did you get patted on the back for? What were you rewarded for? What were you lauded for? And sometimes it's, when I'm working with clients, I have to say, okay, well, how do you know you did a good job in this particular job? And so with this particular client, he was a trainer. We really had to think about it. And it turns out he was constantly selected to be on special teams. He was reducing the amount of training and thus the costs. And so just, you want to show whatever it is that you were great at, whatever that means in the context of your job. Okay. Now here's one. Okay, so in this particular case, okay, so we can go down and show education. So this person graduated from the University of Texas, hook 'em horns, in chemical engineering, and then got into the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, which was probably the best day of her life. And then after graduation, the best day of her life was getting accepted to the University of Chicago. Before that, after graduating from the University of Texas, this person was forced to move to Rosemont, Illinois, and work for a company called APV, a food engineering firm, where she started as an engineer and then moved up to project director and then director of engineering. Now, you might be saying, well, why don't you have information about engineering and project director? Well, the reason is, in this case, is because this is 1991. So now we're talking, we're 20 some odd, 30 years ago. It doesn't matter as much, particularly not since this person has now risen up to become an engagement. She's used all of her, background to get to McKinsey. She's now in consulting, but she started off as an engineer. And that in and of itself is important, because a lot of times if you start as an engineer, for example, and even though you move off to do different things, that background can often really, really resonate with folks later on, depending on what type of job and what type of company you're applying for. But you don't necessarily need to get into all the details of your first job. My first job out of college was in 1989. I was at the Federal Reserve. So I say that, I leave that on the resume, but I don't get into a whole lot of detail because at this point, no one really cares. So the exception to that, and I do have one exception, is I once worked with a client who'd been with, he was head of a telecom company, and he had been for like 25, almost 30 years. But his first job, before he went into telecom, he managed a testing lab for 11 years. Well, he was leaving his job in a telecom company, and there was a venture capital company that had a portfolio company that somehow involved a testing lab, and they wanted to see his experience running the testing lab. So we actually went back in time and, really added a lot of additional information because of that specific need for that information. But normally, no one really needs a lot of information about the way back when. But you don't want to leave off the dates. Okay, so what I have done here is I did leave off the dates just because I think I forgot to put them in. But it's a good idea to leave dates on the education section because people just like to see it. But if you don't, it's also not the end of the world. I'm kind of a big believer in full disclosure because they're going to figure out if you're over 50 anyway. But I have clients who feel very strongly and don't put the dates. But that's kind of a potato. The other thing I would say is I went to high school in a small town in Oklahoma. No one cares about my high school. However, I have known clients who went to high schools that are important, would still resonate on a resume and attract conversation. So maybe Choate or certain military academies, or I recently had a client who went to Stuyvesant High School, and he's like my age, but he insisted on putting it on his resume because Stuyvesant in New York, I guess, it really resonates. So, this is one of these things where you make a decision on that. But if you went to just some little old public school in the middle of nowhere, you don't need to put it on your resume, especially once you finish at the Booth School of Business, because no one will care about anything else. So sometimes, if you need to save space, you can combine education and significant certifications. But if you have the space, often I just create a separate category. So things like Six Sigma Black Belt, CPA, CFA, project management. There's all kinds of certifications. And just think about what matters to your audience now. If you were certified in something 20 years ago that you no longer do, you might think about leaving it off just for space reasons and, because if it's no longer relevant. If you have been quoted in significant publication or interviewed on TV, included in this section, particularly if any part of the jobs that you seek involve, public relations or, speaking to analysts, speaking to the media. I was interviewed by The Economist once, and I'm going to tell you something. That's going to be on my resume until the day I die because that was pretty huge. You do want to draw the line somewhere. Don't mention that you were mentioned in the church bulletin or your homeowners association newsletter because that just sounds like you're trying too hard. List articles and books that you've authored. If you have a huge list, that's where you go to LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great place where you can include everything. People are more willing to click on things on LinkedIn than they are to do so from a resume anyway. So that's where you put that stuff. Board memberships. So you could say affiliations, you could say board memberships, you could call it whatever you want to. And it could be if you're on a lot of public boards, like public companies, I would list those maybe separately from if you're on the board of the junior league. But if you're on any boards, particularly those that really resonate in your community or the community in which you're looking to for a job, make sure those are there. And again, you got to draw the line somewhere. I mean, if you are on a very small board of a very small organization that no one cares about, and I mean, I don't mean to sound harsh, but you know what I'm saying. You want to put things on the resume that resonate. If you are fluent or conversant in languages other than English, you can include it in the language section. Now, sometimes what I do, if we really need the space, is I actually throw it right here in the margin. Now, I have clients in some cases that speak 6 or 7 languages, and we just put it right here, so it shows up on every page, and you're not taking up a bunch of room that we may need for something else. Patents, you absolutely want to include patents if you have them, and I would include the patent number and name. If you have, say more than 40 patents, you can say a complete list, I hold more than 40 patents, a complete list is available upon LinkedIn, and then go put them there. Now, a lot of people like to try to stand out on the resume, and they do this in a lot of ways. I've already given you some hard no's, with charts and graphs. I mean, I could tell you funny stories all day long of the crazy things people look on their resume, put on their resume to quote unquote stand out, but they just stand out in kind of a bad way. So don't try to do that. However, there are some things that people do or are involved in that spark conversation and really resonate. So I've listed a few here that I think are impressive or important, because these are also accomplishments and they tell people something about you. I had a client one time who was a fly fisherman, and he had been fly fishing on like 4 continents. And he put it on the resume, then I took it off. He put it on, and I finally asked him, why do you keep putting fly fishing on? Who cares? And he says, no, Liz, people care. Fly fishing it's a tight community. So I have actually gotten interviews because of that. And so I said, all right, we leave it on. Do not include hobbies or interests that don't demonstrate a unique skill or talent relevant to the job. I mean, don't put that you enjoy watching TV or you love Jesus and, avid collector of thimbles. I mean, that may be wonderful, but some things can make you seem a little strange, and you don't want to do that. Or maybe you do. And if so, just understand it could be misunderstood by some people. My husband and I rescue Cavalier King Charles Spaniels. I don't put that on my resume, but I do actually, I think I have it on my LinkedIn bio, and I know I have it on my website. And actually that resonates because Cavalier King Charles owners, it's sort of a little cult. We really love these dogs, and also that I'm a huge Cubs fan and that I'm a 6th generation native Texan. No one outside of Texas cares that I'm a 6th generation native Texan, but in Texas, it resonates. So know your audience, you're writing for your audience, and I think that's all. I think I want to open it up to questions because I imagine there are a few, and I could talk all day, but that wouldn't probably be good for anybody. So how do we go to questions?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Liz, for all that you've shared, and I'm happy to moderate our Q&A. So just a reminder to all of those attending, make sure that you submit any questions that you have to the questions box on the control panel. And I see there are a few there already, so I'll start with those. The first that we received is a question: do you absolutely need an executive profile or some kind of profile section at the top of the resume?
I guess the question would be, it depends on how much experience you have. If you're right out of college, if you're just graduating from college, no, you don't. But if you have, say, more than 10 years of experience, it sure can help the reader to rapidly see, hey, this is what kind of person I'm reading about. And that's what this is all about. It's making it easier for somebody to see what you bring to the table, what's your value proposition.
Great. Next question. What do you suggest for those seeking to transition, in this case, from federal government to the private sector? Any tips for somebody navigating a transition?
You better run fast. Yeah, what I would do is, I don't know how long you've been with the federal government, but I spent years with the Federal Reserve, which isn't exactly government, but we had our own language inside the Fed. And I think in the government, sometimes there is sort of a different language spoken. So what you want to do is make sure that you're speaking about what you do in terms of what would be relevant to the private sector, and that you think about the kinds of things that you might be doing in the private sector and make sure you've covered those bases on your resume. It's not that hard to transition from public to private or vice versa, as long as you explain what you do in the right way. And I know sometimes in the government, sometimes titles can be a little bit strange. I mean, you could be a GS-13. You want to make sure that you can explain what you're doing and not lie. You can say, project manager, GS-13. That's not lying if you don't give your whole, whatever the technical government title is.
Great. Next question. How, if at all, should one address in the resume long, let's say greater than 5-year gaps in employment?
You don't. It's not at all unusual today for people to take sabbaticals, to take off to care for ailing parents or to raise children. I would just recommend that you not address it at all. If you feel you need to, you can say, I took a sabbatical and cared for my ailing parents. Anyone can relate to that. I have a client who took 10 years off, and he's from a very, very wealthy family, so it was no big deal. But he took 10 years off, and he went to Hollywood and wrote a screenplay. Nothing ever happened. He took all these comedy classes, and he really insisted that we put that on the resume, and we did. It would probably resonate with somebody. But anyway, my general advice is you don't need to. People are used to seeing gaps these days.
All right. And then in terms of length of the resume, I think the sample here is 3 pages. What do you recommend in terms of length?
Well, it depends. So first of all, it depends on how much experience you have, and you really let the content drive the length. But you want to keep it on 3 pages if you can. If you're going over to 4 because of board memberships, because of patents, that's where you throw that stuff on LinkedIn and you just put a line saying, a complete list of patents, board memberships, et cetera, whatever it all is available upon LinkedIn.
Great. Question from an attendee who works in marketing, who has considered creating a more designed resume, but has also heard that some resume tracking systems may not be able to read certain design elements. Do you have any guidance on that issue?
Well, I guess I don't know what kind of marketing you're in. If you are doing marketing for craft, I don't think you want a design resume. But you're right. The tracking systems, they can't read the design necessarily. I mean, they look at they're reading, they're looking for words. So I wouldn't necessarily do that.
All right. And so kind of along the same lines, do you have experience writing resumes specifically for computerized resume scanning, or is there anything in the advice that you've shared that would be particularly helpful for these automated resume screening systems?
Okay, so first of all, I wasn't going to talk about strategy, but the first thing I would tell you is, if your main plan is to write a resume just so it gets caught up in this screening software, your strategy is completely off. If you write, and let me just say this, if you talk about your jobs in the right way, and you use the normal words that you would use that people expect that are standard in your industry, they have as good a chance of being picked up by screening software as any other resume. But my advice is, and I'm going to recommend a couple books to you, is to develop a job search strategy that's kind of old school. Yeah, I don't want you relying just on the internet to try to find a job. Some numbers for you: only 2% to 3% of jobs are filled online. And it's a $5 billion industry, the job posting industry, and that's just in the U.S. So, and the other thing is, if you're just applying online, you lack any information or control, and it's a quick way to get depressed because you have no idea why your resume is not being seen. And maybe it's actually not being seen. It may be picked up, maybe it's in a stack, but maybe no human ever looked at it. Because at the end of the day, a human has to make a decision about whether or not they're going to interview you. So that's a longer conversation about strategy, but no, I don't write resumes just to be picked up by the search engines, because I don't think it's the right way to go, and I know it doesn't work.
Great. Have a specific career transition question here. So this attendee is a physician who works clinically seeing patients, but also works in the medical technology space. So any advice on how to make that clear and sensible on a resume?
I don't know if you have 2 jobs at the same time. Can you ask the person, do you have 2 jobs at the same time?
I can't
Oh, okay. Well, okay. So let me just do my best with limited information. If you have 2 distinct jobs at the same time, but what I'm guessing is that you are a physician by day, and then you probably serve on the board of a medical technology company. If that is the case, you say that on the resume. Just be straightforward and break them out separately. And show dates and explain it. Just speak very plainly about what it is. And congratulations to you for, being in two such awesome jobs.
Great. Another question, if one is looking to transition to an area where she has a lot of volunteer experience, is it advisable to move those volunteer roles above salaried but perhaps less relevant positions on the resume?
I think it depends on the timeline. So if you've been volunteering, let's say you have a full-time job, let's say you're the engagement manager here at McKinsey, but at the same time, you've been volunteering at the local pet shelter, and that's where you'd really like to work, I think you could put that up in the experience section. But what you don't want to do is minimize your work experience, by moving, like, for example, if you were working at the pet shelter and you wouldn't want to put that above McKinsey, I don't think. So the short answer is yes, but be careful how you do it and be very clear and specific about what you're doing, what your role is, and that kind of thing. Some of these questions are a little bit hard for me to answer without additional information.
Right. Yeah. Another question, speaking to the executive profile or executive summary section, is there any benefit to putting, in this attendee's words, an executive highlights section, which would summarize key accomplishments across your entire work history, not necessarily chronologically? So this would, I guess, be in addition to your experience section, but an executive highlights section.
You can do that, but you got to be very careful because it can be really confusing. Some people do that, but then they don't include where they accomplished something. So let's say led $5 billion in acquisitions over a 20-year career, but then you've had 5 or 6 different jobs. So I don't know when that happened or where, or which piece of it happened at one point. And so then I'm the reader and forced to hunt and pack and go back and say, maybe it was here. And guess what? I'm not going to do that. So what I would say is, if you're going to do that, you make sure that you include some kind of profile saying, look, this is what I'm great at. Here are a few examples, and make sure that that's not the only place you mention them. You want to be able for somebody to look at a job and bam, see everything that is relevant to that job there. If you had won an award at McKinsey, for example, you wouldn't have an award section separate to say that. You would have it under McKinsey here. So yeah, be careful how you do it, because some people do it poorly, and then all it does is create a really confusing resume where you can't figure out where and when things happen.
All right. And you mentioned that it's not advisable to look solely online for new opportunities. What do you consider the best method of job searching? Word of mouth, networking? What are some examples of better ways of job search?
Obviously networking, but get this book. First of all, it's about $9.99 on Amazon. Scott Uhrig, who I know, he's actually in Austin. He's one of the best recruiters in the United States. He's built a business over many years. He actually worked for McKinsey. He has everything but the actual PhD, because he didn't finish his dissertation in computer science. And then he always says he lost his way and became a recruiter. He wrote this, and this is the book. I've got another one for you here. Handwritten Rules of a Highly Effective Job Search by Orville Pearson. And he was at Lee Hecht Harrison for a long time. It's very good. But this is a great workbook. What you do, it's very simple. Number 1, create a target list of companies that you want to work for. Number 2, create a list of people you know who work for those companies. Okay? If you don't know anybody that works for those companies, figure out, in LinkedIn is your best friend for this kind of research, figure out on LinkedIn how you can, or if you can, get a warm introduction to the company. And I left out a step. You want to figure out who are the decision makers you really want to meet at any given company. So in other words, not necessarily the head of HR unless you're in HR, but let's say you're a product manager, you want to meet the head of product management. And to meet them, if you can't get a warm introduction, you pick up the phone and you call them and you tell their secretary, I'd really like to take so-and-so to lunch because he looks really interesting. I'd like to get him on the phone. And I got to tell you, I've been extremely successful in my life in doing that. I'll call anybody. And I have many stories of me doing that successfully. So don't be shy about that. People will say yes more than they say no, but sometimes they'll say no. And if so, then you move along. And nobody wants to hear this, right? Because this is actual work. It's actually putting yourself out there. But it's the best way to have some control over your job search. If you put your resume out on the internet and all you're doing is applying for jobs from the privacy and safety and security of your own home, you don't know where they're going. You don't know if anybody's seeing them or why. And then when you don't get calls, you assume it's the resume, and then you tweak the resume, and then you do that some more, and you go into this death spiral where you just don't know what's going on, but you feel terrible, and why aren't you getting a job? The method I suggest, while a lot more work and navigating successful job transitions gets into this in specific detail, it will get you the job. If you listen to what I'm telling you, you will get a job that you want. But you've got to get out and meet people. You've got to get out and talk to people. You've got to ask your contacts if they will make an introduction for you, and be very specific about why. You don't just say, hey, network, let me send you my resume, all my friends. If you hear of any jobs, let me know. Because as well-meaning as your friends may be, and they might want to help you, they won't really know how because you haven't given them specific marching orders. So again, a lot more on that in this book, which like I said, you can get it right there on Amazon. And I would imagine, Adam, you guys probably have some webinars on job search strategy. I thought I saw a couple of them available. Is that right?
We absolutely do, yeah. So, I'll be sure to share links to a couple of those previously recorded webinars and link to these books as well in a post-event email. So, a few more questions. A couple of more specific questions around gaps, but before that, a question about CVs. How do the concepts that you've talked about with the resume apply to academic resumes and CVs?
Right. So academic resumes are much more comprehensive. So with an academic resume, or if you're a physician, you can throw out the 3 pages because you're gonna want to list a lot more information. I think with an academic CV, you can sometimes talk about the transitions that you've made, particularly if you recruited to head the math department at Harvard from another, if you moved your way up the world of physics or whatever. But you need to just think about, first of all, what's next? What do you need the CV for? And if it's just to put online so your students can see it, make sure you've got all the most impressive stuff you've done because you want your students to be very impressed with how smart you are. But the key to all of this is organize it in a way that makes sense for the reader. And that applies to any document, anything you're writing at all. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. And the 2 questions I mentioned dealing with time off. So not for somebody who has a gap in the resume, but for someone who is without a job currently, how do you increase the probability of being selected despite not being in the workforce for, in this case, a few months?
I don't think I would let that worry me too much. If you haven't been in the workforce for a few months, depending on what level you are, that's not unusual at all. I mean, depending on what type of job, what type of salary you're after, it can take months to find a job. So I would just say, first of all, don't get discouraged. And you also don't need to put anything special on your resume about that. You could just make sure the dates are accurate. If you've already left a company, you want to show, that your end date was 2018 or whatever. But the key is to not overthink the fact that you're not working and let that drive anything at all. Because a lot of people, leave companies for whatever reason and look for another job, and it can take a little while. So I would just say, keep your chin up. You're going to find something great.
All right. And then for this person, rather than taking a sabbatical for kids, for instance, they've taken in their words, a kind of fluffy part-time job that they are way overqualified for so that they can be at home more. How would you sell that particular situation?
We just say that. You can say, I took this job, joined this company that has a flexible work schedule so that I could spend more time at home at a time that my children needed me or my husband needed me or whatever. And just say that, just put it out there. And then when you get a call, don't expect that the conversation is, well, are you prepared to work full time again? If that's what you want to do. So I would just say that.
All right. And this attendee during a gap worked a non-professional job such as bartending. Better to leave something like that off the resume or include it? This person has since worked in a corporate role and is in the market for another.
Okay, so you're currently in a corporate role, but you used to work as a bartender. I guess it would just depend on what industry you're in and how conservative they are. Because if in really, really conservative industries and at really, really conservative companies, they could somehow misconstrue that. But I think it shows work ethic that, you worked really hard. When you weren't working, you worked as a bartender. So I would say it depends. Just know your audience. So I'll just stop there and just say know your audience. Because if I saw a resume like that, I would assume that you were a really hard worker and would be impressed that you had the work ethic to take whatever job you needed or wanted to when you needed money. I think it's a good thing.
All right. And then I think we've got time for maybe just, maybe two more questions. The first, where to place education on the resume. So this person has heard that if you're a more recent grad, that you'd put maybe education near the top, but if you're a more seasoned professional, near the bottom. In their particular case, they've earned multiple degrees over a period of time. So yeah, how do you? What's your advice for kind of including education in different contexts?
Yeah, if you're a recent graduate of whatever program, and that's where you've spent the majority of your time rather than in the professional world, put it at the top. If you kids who are fresh out of college, always put their education at the top, because that's what people care most about, right? Is where'd you go to school? Because they don't really have a whole lot of other experience to show for. So it's knowing your audience and what do they care about right now. So if your academic credentials far outweigh your work experience at this point in your career, put those up top.
All right, and I think this is a good last question, because we haven't talked as much, I guess, about format. But what do you suggest as a minimal font size, or are there any other kind of formatting hacks that you could share?
Ooh, great question. Formatting. Okay, so let's talk about this. And I get these. You'd be surprised at how often people ask me this. I use a Garamond 11-point font. I never go smaller than 11 points. The reason I use Garamond is it's easy to read. It looks a lot like Times New Roman, but you can get a lot more on the page without it appearing that you're doing that. I do not use Arial or Arial Narrow. Arial Narrow can be almost unreadable. I do have clients who prefer Arial, and then once we get done, they change it into Arial, and that's just fine. I'm just not a fan. And also Arial takes up a lot more space on the page. So for me, that's kind of how I think about it, is how can we maximize the page space we have? And that is also why I do the format the way I do. So think about it, you read left to right. So what do I want to know first? Where are you working? How long you've been there? What does this company do? What is your job? We describe in a little paragraph what you do. And then what are your accomplishments? Or in this case, in the case of consulting, selected engagements. So everything you do around the resume needs to make it easy for the reader to get the information that they need. I think, even though, of course, we always assume that people look at things on devices. Make sure, so of course they can make a document bigger, but I think 10-point font or smaller is just absolutely almost unreadable. Oh, and also when you send out resumes, if you're emailing to somebody, put it in PDF, because people will open them on devices, their phone, their iPad, and if it's a Word document, it gets all jacked up on different devices, but a PDF will look good on any device and will hold its format.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Liz. That was about I don't think I've ever seen so many questions come in that questions box. So clearly,
Awesome.
Yeah, people had a lot of questions and are appreciative of your advice. So I want to thank everyone for participating. Of course, a special thank you to Liz for sharing all of her insightful and practical resume advice. I hope many of our attendees will join us again this Thursday as our New Year career programming continues with a webinar titled Digital Marketing for the Future, which will explore the global evolution in digital marketing. We are starting 2019 strong with 5 webinars this month, so please visit our events page at careers.uchicagoalumni.org for the most up-to-date schedule of events. I wish everyone has a good rest of your day, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you. Did people get the books? Did they get the pictures of the books?
Yep, I'll send out links for those as well.
Good. Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.